Okay, so we're going to split this lesson up into three parts. Our first part is simply going to be how can we render this bag of popcorn and how can we make it so that when we tap on the bag of popcorn, a kernel appears on the screen. We're not worried yet about adding any sort of animation. We're not worried about removing the kernels. We just want to set up the ability to add any number of kernels to the screen. And as a reminder, the finished product is going to look something like this. When we tap the bag of popcorn, a kernel is going to shoot out with some amount of variability in its maximum height, how far away it shoots from the bag, as well as the direction. This works in such a way that I can tap it multiple times and we'll get that number of kernels coming out. So there's really no limit here. Cool. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio here. I have the routing set up so that our final product is under this demos root, but we're going to be working out of the lessons root. So we just have a blank hello page here that's going to change pretty quick. Just a heads up, this is all being done using Next.js as the framework, which I just find is easy to work with for routing and setting up the React components. But you can use vanilla React, you can use any sort of React-based framework for this. It doesn't really need to be Next. In a similar note, I'm using Tailwind CSS for all of the styling on the components. This is just a set of utility classes that I personally find makes it quite easy to style all of my components without needing to create a lot of bloat in the CSS files and naming. So again, you don't need to use Tailwind CSS if you prefer writing your own CSS from scratch or using another library like styled components. It doesn't really matter. So let's open up Visual Studio Code here. Again, this is a next page file, so you don't need to worry too much about the page setup here, but we're going to be working out of this index file to start. So kind of like we saw here, we just have a really simple page with hello. We're going to change that. Let's quickly set up a container, and this is just going to be a full width and full height container with some background. Cool. So again, this is just setting up our initial container to render our popcorn popper. And then let's create another smaller square that's going to be centered inside of this. So how are we going to center it? Well, we can turn this into a flex container. That's pretty easy to do. Justify center, item center, and we're just going to create another little square here. So this is going to have, let's say, a width of 64, height 64. It's just going to have a white background. Let's give it a shadow. And that should be all we need to do here. And let's just give it a little bit of a rounded container just to make that look a little bit nicer. There we go. So now we're going to get on to the main point of what we're building here. We want to build a popcorn popper component. So I'm going to write this in a declarative way. And what that means is I'm just going to define a popcorn popper. And you'll notice that the compiler complains because this component doesn't actually exist yet. And that's okay. I personally like to write code this way, where I just write down what I know this should look like, even if it doesn't exist yet. And the reason I'm doing this is that now it reads really nicely. This sort of forces me to write my code in a way that is just human readable. Whereas if I immediately jumped into thinking about, okay, what is this popcorn popper going to look like? Well, maybe it's an image and it has a certain source, maybe it has dimensions. You start setting up all of your click handlers and what we call imperative code, right? You're describing how to do things as opposed to just what it is, which kind of goes against a lot of the principles of React. So we're just going to define a popcorn popper. And now this makes sense, right? We have our container, and inside the container, we render a popcorn popper. And now that we've defined that part, we can start setting up what that popcorn popper actually looks like. So I'm going to define a new React component here. This is going to be a functional component. And let's just start by even just rendering the word popcorn. This just proves that, okay, this is set up. It doesn't really matter what the popcorn popper looks like. Our parent page just knows to render a popcorn popper, and that's just going to show up correctly regardless of how it's defined. And really quickly, because we know that eventually we're going to have kernels shooting out the top of the popper, we want to position this popcorn popper at, let's say, the bottom center of this container. We can do this pretty easily as well by turning our parent container into a flex container with justify end and item center. So I'm going to save, and now it's positioned nicely. Let's give it just a little bit of padding on the bottom. And that's just going to make that not look so crowded at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so instead of having the word popcorn, let's render an actual popcorn popper. So we're cheating a little bit here. You can do this however you want, but I already downloaded an image of a popcorn popper in advance, and we can just use that for the sake of this lesson. So let's give this width and height. This is going to be my container for the image. This is going to use the image component from next. But again, you don't really need to do this. Any way you like to render an image is totally fine. So we're going to have image. The source is going to be, I believe it's popcorn. Might need to double check that. Popcorn.png. Yeah, just to show you that's what this is going to look like. We're going to give it a fill. And we need to give it an alt property just for next to be happy. And for our class name, sorry, for our style, we're going to give this object fit contain. There. So we have our popcorn popper. This is obviously a little bit small. Let's just make that bigger. There we go. I think that looks pretty close to what we have in the finished product. Let's just double check. Yeah, so it's pretty close. We could even make that just a little bit bigger. Let's say 32. Let's see how that looks. Twice as big. Okay, that's way too big. So that's kind of somewhere halfway. I'm happy enough with that. Cool. So now we have our popcorn popper, but obviously this doesn't do anything yet. We know that when we click on this popcorn popper, a kernel should appear on the screen. So how are we going to do that? Well, we can add a click handler to our parent div. So we're going to add on click, and let's just call this, there's many ways you can do it, but we know what this is supposed to do. It's supposed to create a kernel of popcorn. So let's just call this create kernel. And again, I'm writing this in a way where first I define all the names of the functions and components that I want to do. I wait for the compiler to complain, and then I fill in the blanks. And this is just going to make our code more readable again. You know, I could have just defined the function inline like this, but that's going to make this component just look messier and harder to read overall. And especially, always try to keep in mind if you're working on a team, in a company with a lot of different people, many people are likely going to be reading and maintaining this code. So you don't want to be defining as many things in line with messy styles and names as much as possible. It's a lot easier for everybody's sanity in the long run to just define them like this. So with that being said, we have our create kernel function. I'm going to define this now so the compiler's happy. And this doesn't even need to do anything yet. It just needs to exist. We can even just have it log that a kernel was created. Creating a kernel, right? And if I go back here and we just check the console, I can click this as many times as I want. And you can see that a kernel is being created. Cool. So what's next? Well, we want a kernel to be added to the screen when we tap the popcorn popper. And this suggests that we have state. as part of the component now. We need to maintain some list of kernels as they're popped. So we can do this with React. This is pretty standard React stuff. We're going to use the use state hook, and we're going to create a new state variable. So we're just going to call this kernels, set kernels equals use state. And I like to add an explicit type here. This is all done with TypeScript, and this will just ensure that we don't try to put anything in the state that's not a kernel. So I'm going to call this kernel because that's the type, right? We have an array of kernels, and this is going to start as an empty array because initially there are no kernels on the screen. And again, look, we defined a new type. It doesn't exist yet. That's okay. We can define it now. So we're going to have type kernel. And this doesn't even need anything yet. We just want the compiler to be happy. And what we want to do is add a new kernel to this array when the create kernel function is called. And we can easily do that by invoking set kernels. And we're going to use the spread operator here because we want the new value of the state variable to be all of the existing kernels that were previously in the state. That's what we get with the spread operator. And we're just going to stick a new kernel onto the end. So this is our new kernel. This obviously looks a little bit weird because the type of kernel is defined as an empty object right now. So let's just give this kind of a trivial ID, right? This doesn't really matter. We just want some property here so that it looks a little more obvious what we're doing. And I'm even going to extract this into a variable. So let's call this new kernel equals this. And for the ID, generally you'd want to use some sort of, either if this was being stored by some backend database, maybe that could generate your ID, or you probably want some sort of, guaranteed randomness here if you're generating them on the front end. But just for the purposes of the demo, I'm just going to do a math.random times 100,000. So this will give us a random number between 0 and 100,000, which should be fine for the purposes of this. We're not going to be creating that many kernels that there's a chance of collision, but it's definitely something you would want to keep in mind otherwise. So as you can see, now when we click on the popcorn popper, we invoke the create kernel function, and that's going to create a new kernel with a random ID. And we can remove this console log now. And what's going to happen? Well, when we click on this, we are going to be adding new kernels into the state, but nothing's going to happen with them yet. And the reason for that is we're not actually doing anything with this kernel's property. We're not using it to render anything on the page. But just to prove that the state is being updated, we can actually log the kernels in the state on each re-render. So if I go to the console, and let's just refresh one more time. So kernels is an empty array, right? And if we tap this, what's going to happen? It'll set the kernels with a new one, and it's going to re-render because we called set kernels. When it re-renders, it'll log the new state with that new kernel. So there we go. There's another kernel with an ID. I'm also just going to add a floor here so we don't have these weird decimals. And that looks a bit nicer, right? So I can click this as many times as I want, and a new kernel will be added each time I tap. So obviously we want something to show up here, and we can do that by rendering the kernels as part of this div. So there's a few ways we can do this, but let's actually add another parent container here. The reason I want to do that is that the kernels themselves are not really part of the popcorn popper. For example, specifically this click handler, It should only be for whatever's in this little box containing the popper. And we know that these kernels are going to be flying all over the place. So I'm actually going to create another parent container here. And let's just give it the same width and height as the child. So that's not really going to do anything yet, but just to show that it is with the correct width and height, you can see it there. And I'll remove this later. I do sometimes like to add a background just to make sure these styles are lining up, kind of how I expect. And now that we've done that, we can just start rendering these kernels. So because we have an array, we need to map it, right? So we're going to do kernels.map, kernel, kernels.map, kernel, and that's going to return a React component. So kernel, and because we're mapping, we need to give it a key. And this is where the kernel ID actually comes in handy, because this ensures some kind of uniqueness when we map it to the page. So, oops, just going to fix the formatting here a little bit. There we go. So now we have this kernel component. Obviously, this doesn't exist yet either. So now we need to create this kernel component. So that's just going to be an empty component for now. That's complaining because it doesn't actually return anything yet. And again, let's just make it return the text kernel. Doesn't really matter. If you look at this part, it only cares that it renders a kernel. It doesn't need to know anything about what a kernel actually looks like. And again, this is more in line with the declarative approach of coding with React. So now what's going to happen? If I tap the popcorn popper, a kernel will be added to this array. I'm going to remove this console log. A kernel will be added to the kernels array, and that's going to render a kernel on the screen. And that'll just have the text kernel. So there we go. Every time I tap it, another element, kernel element, is added to the page, and it has that kernel text. Now, obviously, this looks weird. We don't want the kernels to be rendered under the popcorn popper. Rather, we want the kernels to be rendered initially somewhere kind of at the top of the popcorn popper and centered. And because we might be tapping this popcorn popper multiple times and we want every kernel to begin in the exact same position, with it also being okay if they overlap with each other, we're actually going to use absolute positioning here. So what is that going to look like? Well, to do absolute positioning, we know that we need our parent container to be relative, right? And then what we're going to do is, instead of just returning the header kernel, let's actually return a div. So again, we can start by just rendering the text kernel. But what's going to be different is that this is going to be absolute. We'll do top 0. This means it'll be positioned to the top of the first relative container it finds. And then we're also going to center it. So that's all this left 0, right 0, mx auto does. It's a little bit of a hack to get an absolutely positioned element to be centered horizontally to its parent container. So that should be all we need to do. If I save again and I tap, we should see the kernel text appear at the top center of this blue box. So that wasn't quite right. Why did that happen? Well, let's think about it. So we should be, it should be looking at the parent container. And, oh, I think I know what it is. It's probably that this div also has the max width, and we can probably verify that if we add a background color here. So that's why. centering this isn't actually going to do anything because, as we can see, it's already taking up the max width. But if we were to give this more of an explicit width, let's just say 8 for the sake of example, now it actually is centered. So the kernel text isn't actually centered in the container. That's okay, we're going to get rid of that part anyway. The important part is that this little square is actually centered. So now instead of the kernel, we actually want to render an image of a kernel. And I'm just going to copy this image component here. And then I will turn this into an image. So there needs to be a relative container for the object fit to work properly. Let's just give this a width of, let's try 4. I'm trying to remember what I did in the final product. I think this will look nice. And then this is just going to be kernel. I think it's kernel.jpg. Let's try that. There we go. So you get this kernel, and we want to give this the same width as the parent container. So it's actually centered. Cool. So you can see now this is centered in the popcorn popper. And I can now remove this background. And I'm also going to remove the blue background. So we kind of know that the layout looks more or less okay now. Cool. So what's happening now, when we tap the popcorn popper, we have a kernel appear on the screen. And they're all overlaid on top of each other, so you can't really see much happening here, but they're all sort of overlaid on top of each other. And I'm just going to move the positioning a little bit. Instead of top 0, let's do minus top 2, so it floats a little bit above. There we go. Maybe top 3 even. Cool. So this is starting at a decent position now. And this is kind of where we're going to end part 1. The next thing we want to do is figure out how we can have these kernels remove themselves from the page after a certain amount of time, somewhere between 200 to 500 milliseconds, something like that. And then once we figured that out, we want to add the animations in to really make it just look like a smooth and visually pleasing interactive component. And just to remind you one more time, let's go back to the demos. So it's kind of coming together, right? The parts we're missing are making these popcorn kernels disappear after a certain amount of time, as well as the animations. The popcorn popper grows when you tap on it, and we also have these kernels shooting out with some amount of variability. So that'll be coming up in lesson 2 and 3.